Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to wrap up the North in the Civil War Symposium that was held in October 2003 at the Massachusetts School of Law by allowing you to enjoy a panel discussion. We had typically had two panel discussions, and we did in this one, and our as I told you, not our full professional production. We lost the first panel discussion from the Saturday lectures, and we just don't have them, so I can't let you watch that. But we did manage to save the ones for Sunday, and our panel, because some of our historians had to head back home and stuff, they were mostly local and so forth, left us with just a few people who are still with us at the time. Herman Hattaway, Brooks Sympson, and Mike Chesson sat down, and I believe Dean Belleville is also on the panel, and then I moderated the panel. We took questions from the audience for almost 70 minutes, and it was a very healthy and robust discussion, which I think reflected well on the symposium as a whole. I mean, people just had a good time, and it was a program well done. And so I think this is a good wrap up to it, and I hope you'll find some Q&A in here that stimulates your thinking and maybe teaches you some. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the panel discussion of the North in the Civil War held at the Mass School of Law in October 2003. Fewer interactions necessarily among the faculty, and so we may get a few more questions in, but it's really an open forum, so it's whatever you want to talk about. It does not have to be about what we talked about today. It's what you want to talk about. So sure. We'll go ahead and give it a go.
I've got a word in defense of chamber pots.
Okay.
And which word would that be?
Butler was not the first. You know, I have to teach other things besides Civil War history, and during the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin, Butler's namesake, was our ambassador in Paris, and he was so popular with the ladies, he used to say that old women make the best lovers because they are so grateful. He was so popular with the ladies at the French royal court that Louis XIV, I guess it was, put his picture on his chamber pot. And if I knew anything about French or medieval history, it's probably not the first time that happened.
We remember Franklin used to take air baths. You know, he was a nudist, and used to sit in front of his window with the windows wide open, and buck naked and just take air baths.
He was a great swimmer.
Here's one.
During all the discussions the last 2 days, there was only one. You guys have talked a lot about generals, but there was only one mention, and that was in discussing a portrait or a picture of an admiral. How come admirals haven't come up in the discussions at all?
Well, because the Army guys won't admit that the U.S. Navy won the war. and it did. And our strategy in Vietnam and since, from the sea, forward from the sea, the CNO's white papers, is based upon Civil War naval strategy.
And two, you need to think of three things when you think of Civil War naval history. The war on the high seas, which is relatively minor. The blockade, which, while not decisive, assuming that Bill still is correct, and we, in our book, Why the South Lost, it's not decisive, it is nonetheless significant. But then the Brown Water, the riverine warfare, that is very significant.
Navy commanders in Vietnam studied after-action reports from Union naval commanders in the Civil War.
I mentioned the Admiral, so I'm off the hook.
A question, Mr. Hattaway. Your comment about Jefferson Davis being deluded or in delusion, I think is reinforced by this. I don't remember the name of the conference, but there was a peace conference in 1865 during the winter in Norfolk or Newport News.
Hampton
someplace
Roads.
down there.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
these, the Confederate commissioners that went down there, basically went down there with the same rules that they had in 1861. Would you comment on that?
Well, there's not much I can say, except that you're right. They did not make any progress whatsoever because they were not willing to negotiate or bend, and they should have been. Davis was not willing to bend, but his principal military advisors by that point were. And so it tells a lot about how the surrender in North Carolina was negotiated with some measure of benefit to the South. Of course, they're not going to have any sovereignty. They're going to lose the war, but the initial intent was for the peace to be an easy peace, and it maybe could have been if Lincoln had not been assassinated, and if the radical, well, you know, what caused what? A, B, C, D. The white Southerners were, for the most part, intent to retain a measure of control, sovereignty. They wanted to get the Republicans out of office. They wanted to get the blacks disfranchised, and the whites who empathized or sympathized with the blacks disfranchised. And they began resorting to trying to do that by force, and this results in the gradual radicalization of the Reconstruction process. Race riots in Memphis and New Orleans, for example, are tremendous catalysts in causing the Congress to hold hearings on whether or not the South is accepting the outcome of the war. And by and large, the white South was not accepting the outcome of the war. And nothing more than the Ku Klux Klan illustrates that, although interestingly, I think the scholars who work on that sort of thing say that the secret societies like the Ku Klux were not quite as effective as the wide open societies like the Knights of the White Camellia and the Red Shirts. They were more intimidating because they weren't even under masks.
But do you think Jefferson Davis was mentally ill?
I do, yes, I do. I don't know if necessarily permanently mentally ill. I don't know a hell of a lot about mental illness, except that I am. I'm on 2 antidepressants and 1 tranquilizer each day. So, you know, I think in some respects everybody is a little crazy. Some people are just more crazy than others. I don't really think that Davis was crazy, but I think he was under delusion at the end of the war, that he really believed he could continue the contest under conventional means. I don't have this memorized, but it's delineated in my book, Jefferson Davis, Confederate President, which scholars say that he really wanted a guerrilla warfare and which say not. And William Cooper, again, no particular friend. In fact, I have long suspected that it was he who wrote the damning assessment of how the North won and kept the LSU Press from publishing that book. Certainly no great friend, but nonetheless we shake hands when we see each other and we're civil. Well, he has a recent biography of Davis, and he agrees with me that Davis did not want a guerrilla war, and that he was in fact under the delusion that he could continue the conflict under conventional means.
I'm curious, with the withdrawal of the occupation of the South. at the
In
end of
76?
Reconstruction, correct. Would, and all of you, please, at that point onward, doesn't the South actually end up winning the Civil War, at least?
Depends on how you look at it, yeah.
Of maintaining that.
For 3 generations, let's put it that way.
In other words, certainly the Union was preserved. Fine.
Yeah,
So the
yeah.
North won.
But you've got white supremacy, and you've got
And states' rights.
black peonage and state rights, and the Republican Party is banned from the South until, well, maybe 48 with the Dixiecrats, but especially then with Goldwater in the 60s. And now the South is very starkly Republican. But boy, it sure wasn't until then.
But so, that to me is the piece that so often, I don't know, it just seems to me that Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction
Yeah.
is
From some perspective, the South did in fact win the war, at least for 3 generations.
We won by outlasting the Bluebellies. Eventually, the liberals in Cambridge said to their troops, come on home. I mean, but there's a misnomer. They weren't pulled out of the South. Somebody said yesterday that the troops were pulled out in 1876 or 1877. They stayed right where they were, in forts and camps and bases all over the South.
Those that were still there. Yeah, those that were still there.
They were no longer interfering in Southern elections and race riots.
Number
If it's a race riot,
one,
the Yankees don't come in.
the vast mass of the troops still on active duty had gradually been shifted to the West, where the Indian wars were scraping up. But number two, the South, believe it or not, always liked having troops present, still does, and the troops like the South because it's as far as military forts are concerned, it's a good place to have forts. And so now, actually there was really Reconstruction continuing in only 3 states toward the end. It gradually came to the NC, and so it's one of the great misnomers in all of American history, how many troops were actually removed from the South as a result of the Compromise of 1876. The answer is none.
That's right.
they were just redeployed to different missions.
Mhm.
The question is the possibility of how the South will win the Civil War when, let's suppose when Davis realized the Lincoln new strategies is to destroy the Confederate Army, okay? And if he realized that, then his strategy is the preservation of the Confederate Army.
Mhm. Yeah, right.
So
You're right.
Then Joseph E. Johnson, Fabian strategy.
That's it. You're
looked
right. You're right.
Very favorable.
You're absolutely
So
right.
If I'm saying that if everybody if you instruct Lee and then Johnston and everybody, okay, or all the Confederate Army to avoid throwing the men to the meat grinder and try to do try to avoid land battle, and doing that way, they may outlast
Conceivably.
election.
Conceivably.
Lincoln may lost the election in '64.
Yeah.
And then when McClellan get elected, then
Yeah.
they have a chance to pursue peace.
Oh, yeah,
So
well,
could you
of course.
comment on that?
Well, there's nothing to say. You're right. I think if somehow things had unfolded differently and Lincoln had lost the election of '64, the South would have been able to pull something out of it all. You're right.
When Lincoln is reelected in '64, he gets the same percentage of the popular vote as Eisenhower in '56. They both get about 55%. There is a small difference. Ike had all of the Democrats to contend with, and Lincoln only had a fraction of them, because some of them are outside the Union. I mean,
Yeah.
though he would never accept that. I mean, they're fighting him.
And not only that, the soldiers, even if they might have been Democrats, the soldiers loved Lincoln, and the soldier vote went very heavily for Lincoln.
What were the differences in percentages? The Union forces were quite often decimated because they would actually go into these camps and disease and, things like that would just kill off thousands.
Yeah, disease killed more than bullets.
Far more.
Is it comparable that the Union and Southern both went through the same dilemma?
Oh, sure. Well, yes and no and no and yes. The Southern population, by and large, more rural. The Northern population, by and large, more urban. The Southern people were more susceptible to communicable diseases because they hadn't had measles when they were children. For example, there's a Confederate training facility, Camp Moore, near Kentwood, Louisiana, where the entire garrison was wiped out by measles. Well, that didn't happen in Union garrisons. They'd had measles when they were kids.
the farmers.
Not the
people.
farmers.
Well, all right, there's some exception. You're right. There's some exception, but there's not a single Union garrison that was wiped out by measles.
After Ball's Bluff, Dr. Dyer wins his first favorable commendation, not for anything he does in a battle or whatever, because he prevents the spread of measles. There was an outbreak of measles in a Michigan regiment or something, a bunch of farm boys, and he quarantined them. He isolated it and apparently saved many of the surrounding regiments and kept the casualties down in the one that was affected.
And medicine, even though it was very early, I mean, you know, some medical people had some inkling of what a germ was and others didn't. So you have a lot of these unsterile operations that take place, but on the other hand, you shouldn't underestimate completely the value of medicine. They had vaccines that worked. They knew how to vaccinate against disease, and they did.
And that depended on your doctor and the medical.
Of course,
Your area. So
of course.
20 miles to the west of here, the farm boys maybe didn't get inoculated.
This is
The rural boys maybe did.
very true.
So that would be the conflict.
In the back.
My interest also is in preservation, and I'm not very active in Civil War preservation, mostly in my own community, but you've spoken about Bull Run being in terrible, terrible plight. Are there similar?
Read the Civil War news. Join or read any newsletter from any Civil War organization. I mean, it's a battle I don't think we can win. I
Yeah.
think it's a lost cause.
Well, no, it's a lost cause only in some areas and respects. Franklin is a lost cause, for example, but Chickamauga is not. And Chickamauga is an interesting one because it's very near another lost cause, which is Missionary Ridge. Now, there are some lost causes, but there are some causes saved, and Bryce's Crossroads is certainly a major example. We only fairly recently created a preservation park at Bryce's Crossroads, but we did.
See, even if you save an area at Yellowstone National Park in the middle of the winter, the forest rangers out there are wearing gas masks. Because I have a constitutional right to drive my snowmobile wherever in God's creation I want. And you will not take that snowmobile away from me or tell me I can't ride it in Yellowstone.
That may be on the verge of change, though. The geologists tell us that about every 20,000 years, for as far back as anybody can figure, there's been a major eruption at Yellowstone. But now there's been 70,000 years since the last rep, and so we were way overdue. And we might have a 1,000-mile radius eruption. And in fact, one of the major caldera has very recently enlarged and become much more active.
You are into biblical prophecy.
Yeah.
It's what they say about you is true.
Oh yeah, almost everything they say about me is true.
You know, much of the issue with preservation, of course, we're in that business with preservation through education. As we look at a lot of places around the country, it's astonishing how little battlefield land and significant historical structures are actually under some form of conservation or protection. Now, it gets to a very core question, something that in and of itself could take hours and hours and hours to discuss. But in brief, what it amounts to is that at the time the Civil War was a significant aspect of our collective conscience, the government made a determination as to what battlefield parks were adequate to represent the ferocity of that struggle, and which parks were the most historically important for the purposes of training future officers and future leaders.
Oh yeah, they thought they would use those parks, and did in fact on a number of occasions use them as training facilities.
Sure.
But what has in fact happened, and as you go take a look at this, is especially in rural areas where communities have had a very difficult time building an industrial base or a tax base to employ their citizens, companies go out looking for very favorable tax treatment, and oftentimes they're able to go in with businesses, whether it be a quarry or whatever else, and go out and gut land that otherwise would not be threatened. I mean, there are many battlefields that have no encroachment danger whatsoever, And then there's others like, who would have ever thought the battlefield of Spring Hill, Tennessee would be in danger?
Who would have thought? And yet it is.
Until Saturn cars became this new huge movement
Yeah.
to come.
But incidentally, if you ever do go there, you should also go to the nearby Sam Davis farm. Sam Davis is the Nathan Hale of the Confederacy, you know, I regret that. And it's great. It's a magnificent example of a middle class, maybe upper middle class, but not plantation quality. A middle class southern farm place where it's wonderful because Sam Davis's mother died, and it was so typical in those days. His daddy remarried, and in this case, an 18-year-old girl who brought her 38-year-old mother to live in the house with him. Somebody's got 2 for 1.
But in answer to your question, and you really, because there's so much out there, you really have to determine what your cause is and then get behind it. You can't save it all. We're going to lose much more of it than we do save.
But you can save some of it. And Vicksburg is very interesting because it's been completely surrounded and encroached on a little, but nonetheless, by God, it's a nice park, and it's going to stay that way. Incidentally, I was telling somebody else, you might check on a book by an art photographer named A.J. Meek, M-E-E-K, and me, called From Gettysburg to Vicksburg, the first 5 Civil War battlefield parks, published by the University of Missouri Press. We're kind of proud of it.
Yeah, Maureen.
Question on, at the end of the Civil War, it's sort of politics of command and Jefferson Davis. When Lee went through Breckinridge to get, you know, to ask, let's orchestrate this politically to surrender, and Jefferson Davis said, just wouldn't hear of it. Was Lee then authorized to surrender?
No, Lee was not actually authorized to surrender, but Lee and Breckinridge worked very effectively well together. Lee did the best he could toward the end, and then when he decided he had to surrender, he had no other choice, Davis agreed. Davis said, you're right, you didn't have any other choice, whereas Davis never forgave J.E. Johnston for surrendering in North Carolina, because he did have a choice, or at least in Davis's mind he had a choice. In Johnston and Beauregard's minds, they didn't, but Davis thought Johnston and Beauregard were war criminals for surrendering in North Carolina, whereas good old R.E. Lee did the best he could, and he had no other choice in the end.
Davis kind of felt that way from 62 on.
Yeah.
About those 2 gentlemen.
Oh, Davis and Davis hated, I think, both Johnston and Beauregard, and although it was more intense in Beauregard, the feeling was mutual in both cases. They hated each other. And of course, hatred is weird because it's hard to completely analyze. It's irrational. Hatred is irrational. It's not the opposite of love. Indifference is the opposite of love. Hatred is a warped, sick kind of love.
Speaking of love, I wanted to clarify something about General Lee's domestic arrangements. No scandal, but Mrs. Lee in Richmond lived in 2 different houses.
Did she?
And the first house is on the north side of the city, and it's gone. The house that was referred to is the house where the Virginia Historical Society used to have its headquarters, and later on, you could go in as a tourist and see it. But that house originally was lived in, being boarded in and rented by Rooney Lee and some of the other boys, and their mother decided that she wanted to be in the house with them. But they were running it as a bachelor pad, and whenever they could get into Richmond, were having parties and a gay old time, and not in the modern sense, the 19th century sense. But General Lee went to his sons and said, look, your mother wants to move in with you, and this is how it's going to be. And move in she did. And that's where she was when the Yankees came in.
You know, there are 2 works on sexuality in this, at least 2. The one, the book, who is that guy?
Hattaway.
The story the soldiers wouldn't tell.
Yeah, that one, the story the soldiers wouldn't tell. But also, many years ago in Civil War Times Illustrated, the popular magazine, in fact, it was the same issue that I had an article in, the Kinsey records. They worked out of Indiana University, and it's in the archives at Indiana University of all the Kinsey papers and stuff. And Kinsey uncovered a lot of pornographic photographs from the Civil War. And they published some of them in the Civil War Times article, please. So,
Well, Larry came out with a sequel to his first book, and it's all the brothels in Washington, D.C., and it's got a map.
yeah.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah, but it is a good open topic for somebody to attempt, because I'm sure there was a lot of it. I don't know, however, if the sources are there. Lincoln and the Fairies, homosexuality in the Civil War. I mean, there must have been, they always have been, aren't there? As far as anybody knows, they always have been, so they must have been.
It's been alleged about Lincoln.
I don't know. Oh, I got one of those tabloids. They never let you down. A student gave me a tabloid layout that depicts Lincoln as a woman.
Well, Jackie could have talked about that if she was still here, but Lincoln is ridiculed for entering Baltimore, traveling down to D.C.,
Disguised as a woman.
supposedly. And then Jefferson Davis at the end of the war is captured, supposedly wearing his wife's dress or his wife's coat or whatever. And he is ridiculed for taking on the attire of a female.
And in fact, they even blow that up to the allegation that when he evacuated Richmond, he was disguised as a woman, which is not true at all. But when he was captured, he in fact had flung on his wife's cloak, which matched his. And so that's the beginning of that story. But boy, you can see all those cartoons. They show him in real drag with hoop skirts and high stockings and the garter belts, the whole bit.
Bob is next, please.
I have a stack of books at home about this high that I haven't gotten to yet.
Yeah, most of us are like that.
People give them to me all the time, and I'm so grateful for them. One of those books, as I alluded to yesterday, is Sex in the Civil War. And one of the, as an ex-Catholic myself, I was looking through the pictures, and one of the most notorious characters was an Irish Catholic priest who would minister to the wounded soldiers. And in the book they have letters, very erotic, that he's writing with, in pictures that he drew, and it's, not a lot has changed. As it says in the book of Ecclesiastes, which I'm not a religious person, there's nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new under the sun.
Right.
That's true. That's true.
I have a question about Lincoln and God, which I always impose my views on what I want Lincoln to be.
Yeah.
And I'm
Most
guilty
people
of
do.
that, and it's a monster that I'm trying to overcome, and you gentlemen have helped me very, very much listening. Sometimes I'm a believer, sometimes I'm an agnostic.
Well, that's Lincoln.
Yeah, I would think so too. I know that Congressman Deming from Connecticut once asked Lincoln why you've never joined a church. And Lincoln's reply was, I've never found one that practices what it preaches. And is there any, have you come to that conclusion too, that Lincoln was more of a rational man, but kept his mind open to the possibility of?
You want to take this one? No. I asked him if he wanted to take it. He said no. I think Lincoln was a very rational man, and he read the Bible very deeply. Actually, you know, Lincoln was a voracious reader, but he was a strange one. He didn't read widely. He only read deeply in a very few things. And he did read the Bible very deeply, and I think he thought about it a lot, and he pondered it a lot. At the same time, I think he was the kind of guy that on the one hand, he sort of wanted to believe in God, and he certainly agreed with a lot of the general principles of the Christian religion, but on the other hand, he just really couldn't quite believe that it was true. He didn't really fully believe that it was true. Incidentally, that member of the clergy in my denomination that has a chair, his name is Alan C. Guelzo, G-U-E-L-Z-O, and he read a paper once, and I got up afterwards and about Lincoln's religion. And I got up afterwards and I said, I was on a panel once with Peter Marshall Jr., and he's working on a book to show that Lincoln was a de facto Christian. Do you think such a book could be written? And Guelzo's answer was, yes, I think such a book could be written, but it wouldn't be correct and it wouldn't be convincing. He says, I feel confident from my scholarship that Lincoln was not a de facto Christian.
Well, but there's a new book out on the second inaugural which argues that it is a masterful secular sermon, that in the second inaugural address, which is one of his greatest papers, Lincoln just laid it all out. We both pray to the same God. He has really punished us like Job. And if we have to satisfy the last drop of blood drawn by the slave driver's whip with deaths from both sides, truly the Lord is righteous altogether.
Yeah. And earlier in his famous meditation on the divine will, Lincoln was he's a lot like me in that respect, sit down and write notes to himself. He's sitting down writing what's come to be known as the meditation on the divine will, and he says, here we are, we both pray to the same God. At least one of us is wrong, and by golly, maybe both of us are wrong.
Well, those are good answers. Could I ask you another question?
Yeah.
At Bentonville, when Joe Johnson surrendered, different history books give different accounts naturally, but it was reported that Sherman had written on a piece of paper and slid it across a table to Joe Johnson that I've just learned that Lincoln has been assassinated. And it was reported that Joe Johnson had to compose himself and almost wept.
Yeah, that's probably true.
And he said, we have just lost, the South has just lost the best friend it ever had.
That's probably true.
And from my studies, I believe that to be true, and I wanted to run it by you guys.
Oh, I think, yes, Lincoln. I mean, I don't know that he was necessarily the greatest friend or one of the best friends the South ever had, but I think we've all put it this way, that had Lincoln lived, the peace would have been better. Lincoln would have managed things a lot better. And so the assassination was a tragedy for the South.
And the money he wanted to put in, I think he...
I don't know if he still felt that way. There had been a time when he was amenable to compensation, but I don't know if he was by that time. But that's an important thing. Was it you or somebody talk about the tremendous capital loss? It was... Yeah. I mean, that's mind-boggling. I mean, and it's hard to explain, and it's difficult to convince people that don't want to believe it, but that wiping out of the tremendous capital investiture is what made the South 2.5 generations later, when Franklin D. Roosevelt said the South is the nation's economic problem #1. That's what made it that.
Well, Bob, I disagree respectfully with Herman on this one. Emma LeConte, South Carolina lady, young woman, was quoted by, I think, Jackie Freeman yesterday. Garadel, the French Creole from New Orleans, whose diary I edited and was translated by my collaborator, the people that are writing at the time of the assassination, who are writing only for their own family members, wives, whatever, who never intend to publish, unlike J.B. Jones, when Lincoln is assassinated, Garadel says, we got him, hallelujah, thank God. You know, I was raised by people who said that his assassination was the worst thing that ever happened to the South, that he was the best friend, that no decent person takes joy in murder or assassination. But what were they saying in 1865? Right. And these diaries and journals that are published long after the turn of the century by Southern ladies, talking about what a tragedy this was. But what firms are publishing them even then? Mostly Northern firms, and a lot of the readers are Northern, and they're not going to come out and say, we whooped for joy when we heard about the assassination. I mean, the whole thing has been kind of covered over.
No, that's a good point.
Swept under the rug.
I want to know everything. So.
In the back.
Yeah, isn't that kind of exemplified today with the placing of the Lincoln statue at the Tredegar Union but it had created such a furor that Lincoln's appearance should be made here?
My friends at the Virginia Historical Society thought it was a great thing because they got a lot of visitation out of it. if they're going to put a statue of Lincoln, why not put it somewhere he actually was? I mean, he came in at the Port of Richmond at Rockets, and then he walked all the way up the street with a guard of sailors to the White House of the Confederacy.
Sat at Davis's desk, didn't he?
Yeah, yeah. Put it the other way. I mean, how would people react in D.C. or on Beacon Hill if a bunch of Southerners or neo-Confederates, whatever you want to call them, wanted to put up a statue of Jefferson Davis? I mean, can you imagine the outcry now if somebody wanted to put up this huge statue of Jefferson Davis in Washington, D.C.?
Of course, the most controversial one, and this has been an ongoing thing, there is a statue of Nathan in Memphis, and
Yep.
it's an ongoing thing. People want it demolished, and others
But
don't.
it's also his burial.
It's also his burial place and that of his wife. But Mississippi State University had 3 magnificent portraits of Confederate leaders. One was Forrest, one was S.D. Lee, and the other, I think, J.E. Johnston. And for years and years and years, they weren't identified. So but then they put a plaque identifying who they were. And then all of a sudden, the Forrest portrait begins to be defaced. And they tried moving it from the administration building where it had been to the archives, and that helped a little, but it was still being defaced. So it has since been removed completely from the campus, restored, and on permanent loan at the Stephen D. Lee Museum in Columbus, Mississippi.
See, this comes up every few years. Even up here at Harvard, some years ago, there was a troublemaker, a transfer student from UVA. And this young woman hung a battle flag out of her dormitory window. Oh, man, the furor about that in Harvard Magazine, letters in the Harvard Crimson, everybody's. So some of the Jewish students were saying that they were going to, it wasn't Jewish students, but some other students were saying, okay, we're going to hang out Nazi flags out of our windows. And the Jewish students are furious about that. And over at Memorial Hall, which for Southerners is considered a monument to Southern marksmanship, they've got the names of all of these Union veterans. It's a memorial to Union veterans. But they've got the veterans from other wars too, including Nazi soldiers from World War II. But there are no Confederate graduates from the classes of 1858 and 59 and 60 Memorial Hall because, you know,
They're Confederates.
Yeah, right.
They can't put them there.
Maybe they should take off the Nazi name.
Yes, that would be a good comment.
That'd be one step.
There's a question from here.
Yeah. I have a assassination-related question, okay? I read some book saying that Booth is controlled by some secret...
come retribution, Tidwell,
yeah, from Canada.
April
Yeah.
1865.
A group of Confederate secret agent
Yeah.
stationed there, and then they have ties with Booth and...
Yeah.
Blood on the Moon, that's another title.
You know, the University of Mississippi Press published Tidwell's book, Come Retribution, and I was one of the hired-gun alleged experts to analyze it and recommend. I recommended publication, but other historians have said, shame on you.
My question is...
We don't know. The answer is we don't know. We don't know. They're all kind of amusing.
But there's a ton of circumstantial evidence, and Tidwell was helped by 2
Yeah.
supposedly
Yeah.
Air Force
Yeah.
types.
It is all circumstantial evidence, but it is it's there. It's circumstantial evidence that is there. Yeah.
So it's up to you to draw a conclusion, right?
Well, it certainly is, yeah. I mean, you know.
They captured a Confederate SEAL team, I mean, that's what we'd call it today, who were on their way to D.C. If you can imagine a bunch of Confederates trying to move north toward D.C. in March or April '65, they were loaded down with high explosives and heavily armed. And they were going to blow up the U.S. Capitol and the White House. And of course,
Mosby's men, weren't they?
Mosby, I mean, there are a ton of men in Northern Virginia where Booth was trying to escape to, across the Rappahannock. I mean, why is it that General Lee has approved the redeployment of a lot of men that he probably could have used in Petersburg way up away from the fighting in Northern Virginia?
Yeah, because he believes there's something to it. Now,
Guys from that area,
yeah.
knew the area.
Who knew the geography, the lay of the land. Yeah, Port Royal and all those other places, Rappahannock River and that area.
Now, there's also a story that Quantrill, after he decided to leave Missouri, was trying to get to D.C. to assassinate Lincoln, but he wound up being fatally wounded in Kentucky.
He got that far, though.
He got that far. And Quantrill's really interesting because he wasn't killed outright, and he was hospitalized in the Roman Catholic hospital in Louisville, and he had a deathbed conversion, and he had a Roman Catholic burial in the Catholic cemetery in Louisville. And then some years later, his mother, who lived in Canal Dover, Ohio, came and wanted the body exhumed, and so they did exhume what they were able to get. The grave digger brought the skull to the mother, who wasn't there for the actual exhumation. Oh yeah, she recognized it from a chipped tooth. Yeah, that's my son. So they brought what they could and interred it at Canal Dover. But meanwhile, the grave digger stole some of the bones. We don't know how many. And we don't know for sure if it was the skull, but there is a story that some college fraternity has the skull and uses it in initiations. And the other bones were eventually, they eventually became the property of the Kansas State Historical Society, which for many, many years put them on display. But then a decade or so ago, a decade and a half ago, they said, well, it's not such a neat thing to have human remains on display. Let's inter them. So they had a big full-scale with honors Confederate funeral at Higginsville, Missouri, which is where the Confederate soldiers' home was. So part of Quantrill is still in that original grave in Louisville. Part of him is in his mama's grave in Canal Dover, Ohio. Part of him may be in some college fraternity, and we know for sure another part of him is Higginsville, Missouri.
Question behind, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess a change of pace essay question for any or all of you who want to go for it. As Civil War historians, you're obviously right on top of your game with the Civil War nonfiction.
We like to think so.
What is your relationship with Civil War fiction and literature, such as Stephen Crane, Ambrose Bierce?
I love it.
I love Ambrose Bierce.
Does it interest you, and does it influence you?
The Black Rose, very.
In fact,
Killer Angels.
yeah, Cold Mountain's great. There's going to be a movie out soon on that. I was on the staff of the Boy Scout camp this past summer, and my title was Counselor-Storyteller. And I studied up a lot on Ambrose Bierce stuff to include in my stories that I told. I don't read a lot of fiction, and although I like some science fiction, I know a fair bit about science fiction. But I have read some Civil War fiction, and in fact, I was one of several reviewers. There was recently an anthology of Civil War fiction published within the past couple of years. And the U.S. Civil, is that it?
I don't know, this is an old one.
Okay, the United States Civil War Center for the Study of the Civil War at LSU was published a little journal, you know, and I and a handful of others collectively reviewed that thing. So I like it. What I've read of it, I liked. Oh, I reviewed too, I think it was called My Enemy, My Brother. It was a really earthy, dirty book about Gettysburg, and I reviewed that for Library Journal. Persico, that's his name?
If you want a great book about Gettysburg, it may be better than Killer Angels, and it's certainly more creative fiction, because Shara's writing historical fiction with real characters. Long Remember, McKinley Cantor.
Oh yeah. Oh, my favorite book of fiction really is McKinley Cantor's If the South Had Won the Civil War. I love it. I love that. I've read that one at least 3 times.
Long Remember features a pacifist who has gone west. He comes back to settle his father's estate, falls in love with an absolutely stunning woman who unfortunately is married to a Union officer.
If you take Reader's Digest to know anything about it, in the current issue, there's a new novelette on the Civil War having to do with a romance between a Yankee officer and a Southern girl.
Well, I guess I'd be more interested in the literature, such as Stephen Crane.
Oh, yeah.
There's a high school teacher, a real teacher, who has used his students to research the actual regiment that Crane based this supposed work of fiction on. It's not fiction at all. Crane grew up with a bunch of old Civil War vets, interviewed them, talked to them. This guy, with his students' research, he's been able to document a lot of what is in
A lot of fiction touches on truth, you know. In fact, it is said that all first novels are quasi-autobiographical.
The novelists are reaching far more readers
Oh, yeah. Well, yes.
than most academics.
And
Gore Vidal calls us scholar squirrels.
Yeah.
We go around collecting acorns. You know, I've got more footnotes than you do, you know.
Yeah, but I say, among other things in my review, that, in fact, I also say in the bibliography of Shades of Blue and Gray, I've got fiction in my bibliography, and I say the reason I do is because we know that a lot of people are going to read fiction anyway, and so the professional historian ought to point out.
Banished Children of Eve. It's set in New York City during the draft riots. And there is some great background with Brooks Brothers in it.
That was banished.
Ban it from the Catholic prayer, poor banished children of Eve.
Now, I don't remember the author, but a great one is called A Shipload of Tarts. And it's about a bunch of prostitutes that were evacuated from Memphis, I think, and put on a boat, and they couldn't find a city that would take them, and I think they eventually went back to Memphis.
Over here, please.
Sort of continuing in that theme, a question about what it's like to be an academic historian publishing in a really crowded field. Just sort of what, you know, you're obviously got a way bigger audience than if you were writing medieval agrarian history or something like that.
I think that everybody might have something to say to you on that, but let me take the first one. It's a crowded field, all right, but it's a field much in demand. And certainly in my experience, only the first book was the difficult one to get published. Hell, they come to me asking me to write books, and have been ever since the first one.
Is it harder to get a first book published in Civil War?
Well, sure.
Than it is
Of course it is. That's probably true in all fields. It's harder to get a first book published than it is in a subsequent book. But it's especially...
I meant harder to get a first Civil War. If you go to a publisher with Civil War...
I think so, but let me put it...
Oh, my God, not, you know...
Well, but let me tell you something. If on the one hand, you're an independent entrepreneur and you come up with this book, that's one thing. But on the other hand, if you have a famous major professor who writes a glowing introduction, then you got to see. My doctoral offspring are getting their dissertations published. And they're getting them published because I'm me, and I wrote letters in their behalf.
That's how it works. You got to play the politics, the game. It's all a game.
You know, I never had that experience. I never had any of the experiences that either Michael or Herman
You never had any hard time at all?
My advisor at Wisconsin did not write any letters to any publishers or anything like that, so I didn't have any special intervention. I had no problem
Maybe you're better than
getting
we
my
are.
first book published, which was actually accepted as a book before it was accepted as a dissertation.
Oh, wow, really?
So
You know, that happens sometimes.
it's not, I haven't found anything terribly difficult. I think that this is a two-edged sword, though, that you're talking about. I think that there are people in the profession for whom the lure of an easy dollar has allowed them to write about things that perhaps they shouldn't be writing about, or to revisit the same terrain time and time again. That for all the literature on the Civil War of the last 20 years, there's been a dearth of fresh approaches towards the military and political history of the conflict. That the more novel, more interesting work has come about the culture and memory of the Civil War, about the societies at home, and that by and large, readers of military history narratives seem to want to hear the same Norse saga told again and again. Stephen Sears, for example, just came out with a study of the Gettysburg campaign, in which there is absolutely nothing new. That may not be so much a tale about Stephen Sears as it is about Gettysburg. Andy Trudeau came out with a history of the Gettysburg campaign a year or two before that. There's nothing new. Okay?
But they got published.
Reynolds is shot. The charge fails. Chamberlain's on Little Round Top. The tower falls.
But
There's nothing new about it. In fact, if we know anything new about the battle, and it's not new, in fact, because it's been on other accounts, it's the degree to which the invasion shaped the countryside. That, in fact, the Confederate soldiers were not quite as well-mannered. That there's a reason that Lee issued orders about soldier behavior, and that's because they weren't obeying them. That African Americans were petrified. That, for example, the Bryant farm, right, where the apex of the Pettigrew Trimble part of Pickett's charge took place. Farm owned by a black man had inhabited and fled before the battle. That's a little interesting in how people have come to understand the history of the battle, why it's called Pickett's Charge instead of Longstreet's Assault or the Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble, whatever. That we've had discussions or the memory of Little Round Top, the degree to which Joshua Chamberlain was favored by fortune to survive and thus impose his narrative on what happened on Little Round Top, when in fact the action on Little Round Top unfolds in such a way that had Patrick O'Rourke's 140th New York not been there, Joshua Chamberlain would have been a failed college professor back in Bowdoin. But O'Rourke dies, and so he doesn't get to write a nice little book.
And not only that, Chamberlain was not noticed or recognized much for a long time at first. He's gradually increased in stature until recent times. At the Gettysburg Park, they talk about how over time there was almost no approach to where Chamberlain was, and then gradually was a path, and now there's this fine walkway, just step-by-step process.
See, I think what Brooks is talking about, though, is a very human characteristic. Duke Ellington used to complain that his fans wanted to hear Take the A Train one more time. They didn't want to hear his latest composition. They wanted to hear something familiar.
Sure.
But your point, Paul, is very apropos. In the case of Richmond after the war, my first book, my dissertation, Donald didn't write to anyone to get it published. I was approached by what was then the Virginia State Library, the director of the Virginia State Library, asked me if I had an offer and if I was interested in having them publish my dissertation. So I went back to Cambridge and asked Donald, and I said, I don't want to have the State Library publish this. I want a university press. And Donald said, you fool, sign the contract. You know, sometimes it might just be possible that your dissertation advisor knows more about any number of things than you do, a graduate student.
Yeah.
I mean, please the boss. What is Brooks saying? Please the boss.
But see, David Donald is very, very famous, and so they knew he had this. I mean, if he were Joe Schlabatnik, you wouldn't have got that offer.
You do an imitation of Joe Schlabatnik?
I don't think I can do that.
Okay. Because your imitation of David Donald's pretty good.
It's right on.
Do you know who Joe
I won't do my
Schlabatnik is?
gabor bought, however, and we don't want to talk about what happened at Gettysburg today.
That's Schwarzenegger, huh?
No, that's Gabor.
Gabor Barrett. Gabor Barrett.
I want to talk about the tanks in Budapest.
Because he saw them. He was in the Hungarian Revolution.
Sometimes having a famous professor that can work against you.
That's true.
I mean, it depends upon your personality. Jack P. Green was the big colonial historian at Johns Hopkins for years, and I guess he's still there. And there was a guy that I knew when I was at Hopkins who showed up at the State Library in Virginia. He waltzes into the reading room, and he says to no one in particular, all of the archivists and librarians, hello, I'm Jack P. Green's student. I want you to show me everything there is on the colonial governors of Virginia between 1647 and... Now, how do you think that went over?
Like a lead balloon?
I mean, those people can help you.
Or they can hurt you.
I mean, in some cases, they literally know where the skeleton is buried. But if they don't like the cut of your jib, you're not going to be the one who finds it.
Yeah. Joe Schlabatnik
Because you're a jerk.
is Charlie Brown in Peanuts' favorite baseball player.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting.
college counselor named Slobodkin, and that's not such an unusual name for Russian immigrants. So just reverse the last.
Yeah.
But again, I think going back another way, though, there has not been, I think, the internal or external pressure for people to revisit commonly held assumptions and assertions about the Civil War. For example, I have a student who is now a professor at Gettysburg College, and he studied desertion in the Confederate Army. We have a common assumption of how desertion took place, and so he had all these records from Georgia. And what he found out is the main desertion among Georgia troops was not in late 1864, early 1865. It was rather in late 1863, early 1864. Why would that be? Where are the Georgia troops? In northern Georgia. They could go home easily and go back in the crowd. They couldn't desert very easily when they were in North Carolina. And Lee made sure that Georgia troops would not go home on furlough. So the Georgia troops don't desert at those. So it's geographical proximity in those cases. Why is Wade Hampton defending Columbia, South Carolina in 1865? Because Lee understands the South Carolina troops are going to desert anyway, so he'll make it a military assignment to go home. You begin to rethink commonly held assumptions about what happened during the Civil War. And then I think you can come up with some interesting literature. But if you continue to just repeat what you read in the books you grew up with, you're going to be in trouble. I mean, a good example in my research on Grant, you all know or have heard of the story where a Pennsylvania politician comes to Abraham Lincoln after the Battle of Shiloh and calls for Grant's removal on the grounds of incompetence. And supposedly Lincoln at the end says, I can't spare this man, he fights. Never happened.
No, right, apocryphal.
It's an apocryphal story. Now, how would you'd have to go back to the original source, read the whole source, and Lincoln gives this elaborate explanation of what he's going to do here, none of which is supported by the historical record. In fact, there's documentation against it. There's a letter a couple weeks after Shiloh from Edwin Stanton to Henry Halleck asking if what happened at Shiloh was Grant's fault. So things are different than we think they are. They're not only the McClernand expedition against Vicksburg, but there is an order drafted in February 1863 directing that Benjamin Butler be put in charge of operations in the Mississippi River Valley. Now, maybe there are a lot of spoons in Vicksburg, and there could have been some progress made this way, but the fact of the matter is, can you imagine Benjamin Butler and Nathaniel Banks being entrusted with operations in the Mississippi River Valley in 1863? This would have made McClernand look good.
Yeah, because he took someplace, didn't he?
He eventually ends up somewhere.
Arkansas Post?
Arkansas Post. On what Grant called a wild goose chase, till we found out it was actually Sherman's idea, and then he covered his tracks very quickly. The fact, though, is that a lot of people aren't sitting down and thinking about what they're writing. They're writing, and in terms of a publisher, academics are trained to at least look for a university press, at least for their first book, because it's a licensing. The first book may be tough for some people to publish, but it's actually the most critical book in most cases because it served as your dissertation. It has served as your primary publication, your application for your first job. It is usually the book in which you are judged based for your tenure at a lot of places. So in many ways, it is the most critical book you write professionally because of the multiple functions. But now, there are so many presses. And in fact, university presses under pressures to publish for profit, belying their nonprofit status, that we have university presses probably publishing books they shouldn't be publishing, and trade presses publishing all sorts of stuff, and a lot of presses which seem to me to be little more than somebody's laser printer in the basement, and all kinds of stuff that comes out. So there's an outpouring of Civil War literature, but how much of it is high quality literature and how much of it's pushed by an internal dynamic in the field, that's a different question.
There are also common assumptions that are unexamined. And both of these assumptions can't be right, and they may both be wrong.
Yeah.
For example, it was referred to yesterday about the Southerners reading Sir Walter Scott and just getting carried away by Walter Scott novels. But the contradictory assumption among Yankees is that my ancestors are a bunch of illiterate rednecks.
They didn't read anything.
Now, how could they, according to Wigfall, they didn't have any literature, any press, or any newspapers, or anything else. How could these illiterate rednecks be reading all these Walter Scott novels? There's a professor at SMU who wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin in American Culture. And he examines Harriet Beecher and the Beecher family, and they were a great family in Litchfield, Connecticut. And I've been there. I've been to Litchfield. And the Litchfield Law School, the Tappan Reeves Law School, is where the Southern hero Calhoun went to law school. I mean, my Civil War professor, William Murray, used to start a lecture. He would say, John C. Calhoun, the greatest man who ever lived. Where did Calhoun go to law school? He goes to Litchfield, Connecticut. And growing up there is this little girl, Harriet Beecher. Now, what books, novels, do you think Reverend Beecher's children were reading?
Religious novels.
They were reading Sir Walter Scott. And the boys, not the girls, just the boys, were allowed to compete to see who could recite the most passages from Walter Scott that they had memorized. So don't tell me it's just Southerners reading Walter Scott. It's Americans generally reading Walter Scott.
I'm going to take one more question over here.
Can you, do you have any explanation why there's such demand for Civil War literature?
Oh, God.
Why
Well,
is there such a demand?
I imagine we all have something to say to that. I hope we do. I'll go first. It's the great crimson gash in American history. It's that which made America. Before the Civil War, it was commonly said the United States are. After the Civil War, it's the United States is. It's the great American Iliad. Will the tremendous interest in the war still be as strong when the list of former presidents approaches the length of the present list of former popes? I don't know, but I think so. Because it's such an interesting story. It's got so many characters that are fascinating. It's the first war fought in which the mass of the participants were literate. There's so much original source material, some of which is still being found. My doctoral offspring #1 will soon be publishing, or already has published, his biography of William Franklin, Union General. Found a trunk load of papers in the family nobody had ever seen or used. So that's what I have to say about it.
I think, yeah, it's in part that people like to hear that same story again and again. I also think that's in part because somehow, and we've had some people write about this extensively, including my graduate school colleague, David Blythe, part of remembering is also forgetting. We don't have, for example, a compelling history of a period right after the Civil War that would be so apropos to today's society. Reconstruction, where you have mass terrorism, you have a prolonged occupation reconstruction effort complete with lagging public confidence, an interest in going back home and thinking about domestic economic concerns and the like. But you see, that's a part of history we'd feel uncomfortable about.
Yeah.
All right? There in fact is a monument in New Orleans, now safely tucked away near a big mall, to what was called the Battle of Liberty Place, which in fact is a coup d'etat attempt by white supremacists in New Orleans in September 1874, where they encountered a Republican-controlled police force led by none other than James Longstreet. And there was quite a controversy about this, but you don't go to New Orleans or anyone else for a reconstruction tour.
Who cares?
When people talk about, I mean, I've often astonished audiences by